Software development is one of the hottest areas for choosing a career path. However, like any other field, software development is a quite sophisticated discipline. So if you don't follow a path, continuous learning, you'll lead you to nowhere. Generally, it happens with young software developers who have just landed a new job. To impress their employers or clients, they often tend to make some critical mistakes, which can be avoided without much effort. These are the mistakes you will only associate with new developers because the experienced ones have already learned from them. So you don't make the same mistakes, I'll talk about the common mistakes made by software developers. If you're the culprit of any of these, it's better to stop and start working smarter. Once you know these simple mistakes, you'll be able to design your projects more efficiently in a shorter time and become a pro in a very short time. So let's get started. First, ignoring case sensitivity. Perhaps the first mistake we all make as programmers is ignoring case sensitivity. In programming, it's all about the character and representation. A letter here and a letter there, you'll find yourself struggling to figure out an error in your code. For example, let's say you named your CSS folder with all caps, and then when you're calling the files from your HTML code, you're referring to as CSS in lowercase. The program won't access the desired file, and it can be hard to figure out the error because you're writing the same file name, right? Similarly, when you make a function, make sure to use a capitalization scheme that's easy to recall. That way, it's easy to call functions when needed. Programming languages are case sensitive, so it's best to practice writing functions, variables, and file names using the case and naming conventions laid out by your development team or best practices of the programming languages you are using. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time debugging a code error, which should have not been there in the first place. The next mistake is leaving white space in file names. Remember that saving a file in MS Word and code file is two completely different things. Unfortunately, we only learn the difference after making this mistake by adding space in the file names. All files must be named without spaces. It's easier for the code to access files when needed. If you've observed % signs in URLs, it's because URLs cannot contain white spaces between words or characters. If you named your file myfirstpage.html with spaces, it will be seen with % signs by the browser. To avoid making the empty space mistake, it's best to use underscores or hyphens. While it makes your file name more understandable, it's also great for search engines because Google prefers file names with hyphens. The next mistake is around comments and code formatting. Neat and clean code is part of a good developer's repertoire. Unfortunately, new developers don't understand the value of properly indented, well-organized code. Whether you write whole code in one line or proper spacing with white lines and organizing naming conventions, the code will be running similarly in both cases. However, when you have proper format and new lines, it's easier to find the error and understand the code later. Similarly, developers tend not to be thoughtful when adding comments. They understand its value only when they struggle to remember the function of a specific line when they revisit the code sometime in the future. Remember, it's not cool to use ugly code formatting. More than likely, your commits will get revoked by a senior developer reviewing your code anyway. Plus, when you're working for an organization where different people are working on the same project, it's important that you write clean and readable code. Similar to casing and naming conventions, your development team will likely have a style guide that you'll need to follow, so start there. In general, use proper spellings, develop naming conventions, and decorate your code so it's easily readable by anyone. Every team will have different takes on comments. Some will want comments for each function while others might want to lean towards self-documenting code. Save yourself the hassle and embarrassment of going against the grain. By working with a senior developer on your team for your first handful of commits to get the right code formatting and commenting in place. The next mistake is not validating your input. When you're working on web development projects, in particular, make sure to validate the input on both the client and server side. You don't want to trust the user to do anything right on your forms. Generally, input validation often tells the problem in input acquisition at either client or server side. More importantly, there are some very easy input validation tools, especially on front-end developers. For the back-end developers, there are simple annotations that make sure the submitted input is compatible with the code and whether you should keep it as part of the code or not. If you're developing for user interfaces, pick the most restrictive user control for the data type you're trying to capture. For example, in a .NET application, if you're looking for a floating point value only, you should select a control like numeric up-downs instead of a text box, because the numeric up-down will only take numeric values in the range that you specify. This type of selection means that you don't need to worry about edge cases where the user could input ABC in an input field when you're asking for their age. The next mistake is ignoring performance. New front-end developers will kill site performance by overlooking the effective image size on the website's performance. Make sure to use the right size of images. That way the program loads faster. Moreover, smaller images have fewer problems with visual quality. So image optimization is a must-do when you're writing web pages. More importantly, image optimization is easier to achieve when you set a maximum image resolution on your website. Applying this rule makes it easier to get uniformity in your web pages. Also, adding SVGs in place of PNGs and JPEGs is an excellent way to optimize your images for a web page. For backend developers, you can be killing performance by hammering the database thousands of times for a poorly formed SQL query or having a query embedded in a loop somewhere. During testing, it might not seem like you're killing performance, but as the seemingly small database grows over time, your once fast query is now taking 2 seconds and stalling the performance. The next mistake is using too many libraries. Modern programmers are spoiled with choices when it comes to using libraries. While libraries help achieve results faster, overusing function libraries tends to bulk the code. As a result, the program takes longer to load, and the performance speed reduces. Interestingly, there are many functions that you can write on your own, so you don't need to import that library for them. This is a better approach because it reduces the load on your code base and makes it more efficient. Another hack is to use libraries with smaller sizes. Then it won't weigh down your code too much, and you can achieve the same efficient functionality through your library. The next mistake to avoid is not following the standards. As a web developer, you need to follow the standards of modern websites. You're more likely to make responsive websites and applications for mobile devices. Especially in these times, a responsive website differentiates between a successful e-commerce store and a failed one. Responsive design means entertaining all types of users, whether they're on desktop or mobile. There must be something for everyone. Add media queries and responsive typography to make sure your website is more responsive. Simply put, make sure the font size is easily readable on a small screen, as well for larger ones. As a developer, you should know at least the latest standards and features of the programming language you're using. If you're implementing a new function from a code snippet you found on Stack Overflow that was posted in 2013, more than likely there is new, more efficient way to complete the task with a new language feature introduced in the last decade. The next mistake is writing a Stack Overflow too quick. I always encourage new programmers to take help from Stack Overflow, GitHub, and other coding platforms, but at the same time, it's essential to think critically and implement your own code for complex problems. If you rely too heavily on other platforms, you'll quickly lose your creative touch and dampen your problem-solving skills, and may find it tougher to deal with unique coding problems that may arise in the future. I suggest you try your best at the start and only resort to Stack Overflow once there's no other option left. Now that you know the mistakes to avoid, watch my video on the top skills needed to be a successful software developer. See you in there.